Okay, so here we are once again with Luke. If you don't know who Luke is, check the other video, which I'll link in the description. So, and we're not live; we are recording, so we can edit anything out we don't like, or anything that might invoke the Fifth Amendment. So,
Yep.
So anyway, last time we talked about a couple of things, and one of them was the skeleton key concept in the Old Testament.
Well, actually, the whole Bible, but the idea is that it's really when you combine sort of memorizing or understanding well bits of scripture, and then when you come up with a bit of life that matches it, it's the resonance between the two that gives more meaning to the bit in the Bible and gives you a way to look at the thing in life.
Okay.
And so a really simple example would be there's a bit in James that says, count it all blessing when you encounter various trials, for they perfect you. But the sense there is you have to be ready for the trials so that you will act well when you hit the trials. And I still remember this discussion I had with my wife where I was talking to her about how I prepare for trials and try to resist temptation and blowing up at people when they push me or whatever. And I found out that the way that she prepares is very different from the way that I prepare. And it was really neat because same scripture, but very different way to actually put it into action. And then I came across, there's a New York Times article that talks about why men do not revolt. It's a book review and it says that basically the choice to resist, like the communists in Poland, has to be made before you actually do the resistance. You have to, it's like with the basketball game, you have to train before you get on the court. If you haven't trained before you get on the court, you're not going to perform well. And so the same is true of dealing with people trying to crush you.
Okay.
If you don't make the choice and figure out how to resist that well beforehand, then you're going to get taken out by people who are more prepared than you. But it's like you can't get that meaning from that bit in James 1 all by itself. That's why I call it a skeleton key, because it's really when you see the lock that it matches that it starts making sense or making a deep sense and connecting to real life in the world and how to do things that I think are pretty important.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Buddhists would call that synchronicity, and it's available in other texts too. And I guess my question would be, why attach a belief in a deity to that skeleton key usage of the Bible? Because I mean, there are Bible passages that I can use and that I have thought were remarkable, as an atheist. But what is the necessity? I mean, there's no necessity for a belief in that respect, right?
Yeah, well, so this gets into the difference between sort of cafeteria choosing passages versus you find passages that you like, that make sense and that you're inclined to do and believe anyway. But then you look at nearby things that might be a little less intuitive, or maybe even they seem wrong. And you sort of have a choice there. You can say, well, somehow I'm looking at things wrong, and that's actually correct. Or you can say, nope, Paul was just stupid there.
Yep.
And those two different choices are going to lead to a very different approach when you actually run into situations in reality that somehow connect with that other related piece of text. And so if there's some sort of divine inspiration, then there's going to be a connectivity between things.
Right.
Whereas if it's just humans throwing crap against a wall, even if the crap has been refined over time so that only the nicer smelling, now I'm going into what you didn't like. Anyway, you can have some amount of refinement, but we would still hope that we in the 21st century have far better things than every single point in the Bible, either better things or scientific papers that show exactly why this is good.
Okay.
Right. But if on the other side, that isn't true, and when you do this spreading out thing, where you find the things that you trust and then nearby things you find out actually were trustworthy when you go through the situation and mold yourself to it, and you iterate on that, then you start wondering about how that text got there.
There is a little snippet from a 12-step program praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Okay. And this involves, and I'm pushing back on the belief idea, right? This involves, for an atheist to interpret that, that would be that basically you use prayer or use some sort of ritual to get outside of yourself and find acceptance of whatever's happening in the universe, not from the perspective of what can I use or what do I think or what do I believe. Not about me, but rather outside of myself and looking to that synchronicity, right? Outside of myself. So when you, now you said it would help to have a belief in the connectedness of everything. There are some atheists that believe that.
This isn't really connectedness of everything, but like the idea that the whole universe is connected is very different from if you find this bit of text in the Bible reliable, then the nearby ones might be reliable too.
Yeah.
That's a much more local connectedness and a textual connectedness applied to living in reality, not universal connectedness.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a practice that I do, and I call it praying, basically. Mm-hmm. An atheist prayer, which involves not praying to something or not requesting some intervention by some intelligence, but rather praying to quiet myself and become more aware of those patterns around me that will lock into whatever the situation is that's bothering me. Okay, so if I have some sort of a seemingly unresolvable social, bumping into some other person, right? Bumping of wills, that sort of thing. And it starts to aggravate me or concern me, I will do this prayer. And my Buddhist way of doing it is to actually use my hands to pray, right? That sort of thing, outward, and open up. And it's just amazing. Within 3 days, I could say that prayer was answered, because I will run into some situation, see some TV show, or have a thought, or run into some other situation that matches it perfectly, and I become enlightened as to what I'm to do about the situation. And after 3 days, I feel entirely different about this wills bumping into each other. I can let it go entirely. I can let my will go, that sort of thing. So, I mean, and all of that is done without any belief in a deity. It's just a belief in, I think it's a belief in the power of human psychology in conjunction with the complexity and the absolute beauty and synchronicity of the entire universe and nature. Okay? Because everything is connected in all of these patterns. You simply have to open yourself up to see them. But if you're overly concerned with yourself, if it's me, you're not going to have that ability to make those connections or see those patterns. So,
yeah.
Anyway, same thing without a belief, Luke. Sorry.
Well, I really like that. The whole bit about submitting to one another in Scripture is supposed to, I think, get at some of that. And there's also there is a suffering that goes through with giving up your will, right?
Yeah. Well,
and you're in some sense you're letting the other person win. In another sense, you're picking your battles, because if you try and fight all the battles, you're basically going to lose probably all of them or almost all of them.
Yeah, but it's like putting like if you get a cut and you put alcohol in the cut, right? It hurts like hell for about 3 seconds, and then all of a sudden it's numb.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't hurt anymore. Same thing. Giving up your will works like that.
That's how I would interpret the call to suffer in the New Testament, especially, is we're so afraid of pinpricks.
Yeah.
I mean, look at all the flame wars online. People can't handle the tiniest bit of insult without returning in kind.
Right.
And so Paul has this bit about the present suffering is incomparable to the glory that's coming. But we're so afraid of a little bit of suffering that we're not willing to go through it.
Right.
Whereas you've discovered that if you just don't fight back and try and understand the situation, all of a sudden 3 days later, probably sooner, I'm guessing some of the time, you actually learn how to act much more wisely so that the will of yours that's left over can actually have more of an impact on the world.
Yeah.
You're actually closer to omnipotence after you do that thing.
Right.
Than before.
The same thing with alcoholism and drug addiction. When you give up trying to fix it yourself, when you completely give up your will, suddenly you have tremendous power to fix it.
And this actually,
it's paradoxical.
Well, this gets back to actually belief in God, because God is not omnipotent in the way that most atheists who want God to be omnipotent, if you look at the Bible. There's all sorts of shit that he lets happen that you would expect omnipotence to make not happen if you have this specific concept of omnipotence.
Okay.
This concept of omnipotence really only has God's will being real. Everyone else's will either doesn't exist, or the instant it would conflict with God's will, it gets flattened or deleted or reprogrammed or whatever.
Yeah.
And so there's this understanding of God is actually I think a reflection of people's self-understanding.
Okay.
And Scripture actually says, imitate God, but it has to be imitate what you think God is like. So if you think that God wants to respect as much about creation as possible because there's plenty that can be redeemed, then you're not going to go crushing and stomping and raging and so forth and so on. You're going to try the hardest that you can to work with what's there.
Yeah. So how would that work with omniscience? Like one humbling and useful position is to understand what I don't know. To constantly, when I learned a tremendous amount about cell biology, I immediately go and review all the things that I don't know yet, don't understand, right? So if God is omniscient and we're to be like God, would that be to think we're omniscient too? I mean, is that part, how does the Bible handle that? Or how do you handle it?
The way that God often uses omniscience is to warn you about your default trajectory. If you don't do anything to change, this is where you're going to end up.
Right.
And so it's not actually a prediction of the future, because the goal is for you to realize that this is where you're headed and then to deviate trajectory.
Right.
And it's like God isn't using all of his omniscience, just like he isn't using all of his omnipotence.
Okay.
And instead, the use of the omniscience and omnipotence is to grow our own knowledge and power as much as we will let it be grown before we start using it terribly. Okay. But so often we grow in knowledge and power and then end up using it terribly, and then God has to kind of like either start over with a new person and group of people, or humble us and then wait for us to grow in a more healthy way.
Yeah. So it just occurred to me that belief in a deity could be setting a goal for your own, basically what you want to be or what you want to become.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. That does assume that the deity has no causal power, but I think a lot of people act that way anyway.
Okay.
So there's a lot of stuff to be researched on whether people actually believe God can act, and especially in a non-statistical way. God helping me find a parking spot. Come on.
Yeah.
But what if God can help, say, a group of oppressed people configure their behavior and interactions with the outside world such that they are not provoked to act violently? So, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. and the protests he did, where he basically goaded white people to attacking black people, including kids, on television. The blacks weren't resisting in any way except from marching through. They're probably breaking a law by marching.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the country, that's especially the country that's not used to this kind of racist, abusive, oppressive behavior, responded in outrage. But if you can look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s, he has some guidelines for the bus, the bus protests, and he says you have to be holy. And he lists a bunch of things, which is basically be super polite. If some older person comes along, white or black, give them your seat. Don't respond with violence, whatever you do. Don't respond. Yeah. Keep your mouth shut. And it's just the amount of self-control required in order to resist in that way is almost supernatural.
Yeah.
But there's an open question of, could you possibly detect God helping you endure suffering like that so as to expose evil for what it is?
Yeah.
Because as I think we saw in the last few years, if blacks or any oppressed minority react in the amount that you would expect them to, the amount that you would if you were in that situation, oftentimes it can be portrayed as they need to be put down. So their level of good behavior, I think, has to so outstrip what's considered good behavior by the oppressors.
Right.
It's very, very unfair.
Yeah.
But that's actually the pattern you see in the New Testament, is you must love your enemy. You must turn the other cheek. You must be so much better than them in this behavioral way. And I think that's exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. did. And it's just the powers that be can always construe behavior as evil that's far less evil.
Right.
It has all sorts of bending abilities and exaggerating and the opposite for its own behavior, that you have to exceed those abilities to exaggerate in order to bring goodness into the world and expose evil. And again, the overarching topic here is, when can you detect divine action? Is it detectable in helping you suffer to expose evil for what it is? That's not your typical expression of divine power if you look out at atheists and Christians arguing with each other.
Yep. Okay. So I think the next topic may come around and come back to some of that stuff. You see, I don't see a belief in a deity as being necessary for any of that. And I mean, you could follow that prescription without any belief in a deity. I mean, you do have to have some strong faith in life itself, right? In just the beauty of life and death itself. You know, our own patterns, right? And you have to have basically make a decision not to fight any of that. A decision of acceptance of this is what is, this is how it works, and to see the beauty in it and to have gratitude for the parts of it that, you know, are working well for you, I guess, you know, the extreme gratitude. Like one thing I'm extremely grateful for is that I got to be at all. And I mean, I obviously got to be. And there are so many other possible potential beings, an infinite number of them, that are never going to get to be. And no matter how long I live, I got to be. I'm here. I'm doing this, right? I was chosen, that sort of thing. By the randomness of evolution and nature and whatever, I was chosen. And I feel an extreme gratitude for that. So you have to make, I guess you have to have some attitude. So it's an attitude, right? Not necessarily a belief. And
given how you described yourself, I'm just wondering if God showed up to you, if Jesus showed up to you, and you were convinced that the New Testament was true. Let's just give a solid version of God.
Yeah.
What would you say? What would you ask?
What would I ask? I'd be a little disappointed that it was that simplified. But what would I ask? I don't think I'd ask anything. I have nothing to ask.
See, that makes you pretty weird, I think.
Really? What would I ask?
Well, being so grateful that you exist, being so willing to suppress your own will and let the world exist around you.
Yeah.
It's like you're more Christian than most Christians I know in saying this.
This is secular Buddhism. Anyway, okay.
I mean, the question I have about Buddhism is a lot about it. With my naive understanding, is you're supposed to actually let go of your attachments.
Yeah.
Which to me suggests a possible erosion of a will to go and try and do real things in reality.
Yeah, that's there's a conundrum in 12-step programs with that too. Admitting you're powerless over alcohol and that your life has become unmanageable, but at the same time, you're required to do all the things that you need to do in order to sober up, right? So, I mean, you're giving up, but you're giving up, you give up attachment, but you're still attached in a lighter way, right? Mm-hmm. You're not attached in an obsessive way. You're only attached as attachment is needed. I mean, you have to attach to your appetite in order to feed yourself, right? And you should be aware of your appetite, and you have to be attached to pleasure in order to feed yourself, in order to do pleasurable things, in order to be motivated and whatever. But you don't want to be attached to outcomes, particularly, okay, to the future, to worrying about it or obsessing about it. So you stay unattached to your goals in a certain way, but you're still attached as by nature of what you are. So you do the things that you are naturally inclined to do as with as much attachment as is needed to be what you are, to be functional. It doesn't mean to denounce everything, to give up all your goods or anything like that. It just means to not be particularly pissed off when somebody goes in front of you in the line, and suddenly you've lost some of your precious time, right? To just let go of that, to be willing to be willing to be loosely attached to all of that. And that's kind of what it means. So the detachment thing and the thing about suffering and what did somebody say to me? I can't remember exactly what it was, but giving up all desires and attachment means that you never have fun. Bullshit. That's not Buddhism. That isn't what it means. It means to give up the parts that are dragging you down, that are binding you, or to the enslaving you. That part, you give up that part. You don't have to give up the part about what you are and how you live. So anyway, that's how it works.
So do you know how true that is to sort of non-secular Buddhism?
I think there are probably 10 times as many schools of Buddhism as there are Christianity, and there's quite a few of those.
Yeah.
So, there's just all sorts of doctrinal people that get into certain doctrines or certain ideas or certain practices, and you're going to find a lot of differences. So secular Buddhism is something that I pretty much self-rolled. Yeah. Because I think that is the true message of Buddhism, that you create your own version of it. Get hung up on dogma.
There are a lot of similarities to bits in the New Testament there. Like deny yourself is probably meant in something like that way. Don't be anxious about tomorrow, and
right.
Things like that. So there's a bunch of stuff that I think is very comparable.
It is.
One of the ways that I try to explore possible differences is there a difference between being an open system and a closed system? And the physical version of this would be, imagine constructing a total solar shade around the sun.
Yeah.
Humans could continue to exist for centuries, millennia, a few of them using nuclear power.
Yeah.
But it would be a very degraded life, and it would end probably a lot sooner than otherwise.
Right.
Is there for lack of a better term, is there a spiritual analog of that allows you to be treated badly and not respond according to Newton's third law? Right?
Okay.
What is it that allows every action to not have an equal and opposite reaction? Because now, because I'm working analogically, I can't say that the laws of physics prevent you from acting nice when you're treated badly. And nevertheless, most people seem to act in kind. And so what is it that allows you to violate the analogous Newton's third law? What is it that allows you to act like an open system rather than a closed system?
I've got this crazy philosopher that comes onto my channel, and he's, I call him a weenie. And he gets under my skin. He can get under my skin. And I react to him in kind. And it never turns out well. And the only way I found of dealing with him is to get rid of him. Just put him in the back room, get rid of him, because it never turns out good, this back and forth, and there's no way to stop his barrage. But anyway, that's interesting.
Sometimes
I should apply that to the weenie.
Yeah. Sometimes a third person who can characterize both of you in a way that you can't do it yourself can be helpful, but sometimes it's not worth it. Yeah.
Sometimes it's just it makes more sense to just walk away, to walk away from something and not engage, that sort of thing. Need to do a little bit of that, but anyway, something that we did have a good conversation yesterday, though, which was cool. Anyway. But there's always a lot of work to do. As far as the interesting thing, one interesting example, there was a long time ago, we had a dog that cut its foot on a fluorescent lamp, and it was bleeding to death. And we had to race to the hospital with that dog on the floorboard, right? And my dad was driving erratically, and or my mom, I can't remember who the hell was driving, but just very erratically and cutting people off and doing all sorts of stuff. So now when I run into a situation in traffic where somebody will come flying through and cut me off and run ahead, I was imagining that they have a dog or a child bleeding to death on the seat and say, okay, fair. It's like, the contrast that with, they cut you off and it's like, God damn, that person that, they did this horrible thing and they're assholes and I need to judge them, and I need to start imagining what they look like, what the look on their faces, what's in their head. I could just, fantasize away until I'm so angry. And the truth of the matter is that they've zipped ahead. They completely forgot about me. They have no consciousness, probably never did have consciousness of me, never had any intention of doing anything to me. And here I am cogitating for 10 minutes, and I arrive at my destination and somebody says something to me, and the first thing I do is bite their head off. Counter that with just saying, okay, that's cool, fair, and the other thing that really fascinates me is, I swear, if I'm on 35W or I-35 going through Minneapolis, if I let a person in who was trying to get in, if I back off and let them in, by the time I get to work, there's a tide of good karma that proceeds and arrives before me, and everybody is nicer to me on that day. And and I was like, okay, I know this is anecdotal, right? I know it's all in my head or whatever, but I don't care. It works.
Well, your whole disposition will probably invite more of the same disposition. So if you bite someone's head off, they're going to be more interested in biting your head off, and vice versa. If you decided to give up a little bit of your opportunity that never mattered in the first place,
right,
with somebody else, I mean,
yeah, and you not only invite it, but you're also more aware of the positive things when somebody does it.
Yeah,
you're not going to miss the nuance, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, so I don't think any woo is needed at all to explain that.
No, not at all. It's just a way to live, and that goes back to that Buddhist unattachment. You don't become attached to that incident so that you cogitate. You just say, okay, let it go, gone. It's happened, it's gone. That sort of thing. You let things pass through you like a breeze.
Now there is some research that suggests one's ability, sort of statistical ability, to be able to do this depends on the ratio of hurt feelings to the opposite of hurt feelings, joyful experiences, whatever.
Yeah.
And that if you have too many hurts in comparison to good things that have happened to you, it's much, much harder to react in the way that you describe.
Right.
And so one thing that I find important for sort of any interpretation, whether religious or not, any way of life, is, does this work for just people like me, or can this work for many, many, and arbitrarily many people?
Right.
Because I'm in a very privileged position, so any philosophy of mine, like I could, if I wanted to, operate with the most brutal free market, laissez-faire capitalism model, and my life could fit it, and I could do well. And it's just obvious that it screws over most people.
Yeah.
But the same can be the case with a religious or secular, but kind of shows up religious in terms of how to organize your thought and behavior, if you've had more good experiences than negative.
Yeah.
So that's just something to be wary of.
Yeah, I don't. The thing is that in order for my feelings to be hurt, I have to have a sense of entitlement and entitled self, for there to be a hurt, right? I mean, I can go through horrible things, right? And I can go through them, and I just thought of one I went through, and I can go through these things, and I can take them as an assault on me, okay? And I can have a hurt feeling, okay? Or I can just feel the pain as the pain is there and not make any attachment to it at all. And then I find it hard to describe that as having hurt my feelings, as having an event or something or somebody hurting my feelings or damaging me, if I have no sense of me, if I have no permanent little tally of justices and injustices going on in my head. I can let that go as well.
You're making me want to look at Buddhism of various sorts among oppressed minorities.
Yeah.
And how they deal with it, because their entitlement wouldn't be the right word. Deserving the same treatment as the would be the measure they're using.
Yeah, I guess when I use the word entitlement, I only want it to apply to myself. I don't want to ever say that somebody else has it, because that is what I'm guarding against, is my self-entitlement. Not, I don't look at another person that way and say, you entitled bastard,
Sure.
I feel
like it's a useful category, because you can have expectations. Like, you just grow up expecting things. I mean, your parents are the most normal people on earth because they're where you grew up.
Right.
And so one can be entitled without that being something you should be guilty for. It's just, there comes a time when you have to realize that your family is weird in all sorts of ways, because every family is, and you have to find some way to correct some of the errors, exaggerations, and so forth. So being super judgmental is, I find that the most wickedness that happens in the world comes from people who are super judgmental. And so being super judgmental seems to just increase the amount of terrible in the world.
How about them fundamentalists?
So it's funny you asked that, because a few months ago I got finished listening to Karen Armstrong's The Battle for God, which was this book put out in 2001 or 2000 maybe. It came out before 9/11, and she was looking at Jewish fundamentalists in Israel, Islamic fundamentalists spread over the Middle East, and Christian fundamentalists, and what's keeping them going.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting book. Among other things, the history of how terrible the West was to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Explains why they're skeptical of democracy. Egypt was given this fake democracy by Britain, where any decision that impinged on Britain's financial interests got vetoed. So they didn't actually have a real democracy. And then in Iran, the Shah was killing hundreds of people every month for protesting. They were nonviolent protesting. And then, was it Carter? Might have been Carter, who praised the Shah for being an excellent example of in the Middle East. It's like, is there any reason that they'd be awfully skeptical of the West's way of doing things?
Right.
But fundamentalism at its core, I'm inclined to believe, is people who refuse to let their identities get erased.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, especially, with Jews, what other ethnic group is so identifiably connected with something that is 2,500 to 3,500 years old. And they got treated really badly in Europe because they refused to assimilate. And so, do you just have to refuse to assimilate to be a fundamentalist? Well, the Amish, are they fundamentalists? If so, they're not obnoxious ones.
Yeah, no, they aren't.
So I would try and distinguish between wanting to hold on to your identity, even if you're not going to embrace everything about our scientific and technological world,
right,
versus thinking that everyone else has to be like you. And the curious thing is, the belief that everyone should be like you is very modern, because we want everyone to adopt free market capitalism and consumerism. And sociology has shown that consumerism is an incredibly homogenizing force. And so the fundamentalists who think everyone should be like them, are they actually imitating modern beliefs of everyone should be a democracy, everyone should be like free market? And Karen Armstrong contends basically that fundamentalism is an exceedingly modern phenomenon. It like, when you react against a force, and you're basically only reacting against them instead of being for something, you end up becoming the negative image of the thing you're reacting against. It's like Newton's third law. I mean, if you're going to push against, you're going to push in exactly the way you're being pushed on.
Right.
And it's a complaint I made of all the people who gave Donald Trump airtime, is that they ended up having a little Donald Trump in their heads. And the more time they spent talking, listening to him, the more he occupied their brains. I'm like, how about
Yep. So. Yeah, what a horrible disease that was. I am so happy that I'm starting to recover from having that thing in my head.
Yeah.
It was horrible. That was the most unendurable part about that 4 years is just the amount of him that I had to look at and hear and think about. And he was one of those guys that I would not choose to be around. I would not invite him to dinner. I would not get in I would not sit next to him in a bus. I would not listen to him because of the way he aggravated me. And yet here he was constantly barrage in my head. It's like, Well,
what was kind of eerie is that my wife had been listening to this History of Rome podcast. And I mean, our founding fathers, Gibbon's Rise and Fall came out in 1976. Yeah. And the founding fathers of America, I think, knew a bunch of that history. And they're demagogues who successfully rose to power. And the Constitution, Articles of Confederation, all the documents and talking that happened at that time was like, how can we avoid these errors?
Yeah.
And yet we failed to,
Yeah.
and we didn't see him coming. But it's not a new phenomenon. Demagogues come on a regular basis, and it's like, what in your population makes you amenable to a demagogue? And we clearly weren't. Our intellectuals clearly weren't warning us appropriately.
Right. In my 70 years, I saw the United States come close to the brink of something weird that I'd read about in other, that it can happen only other countries. But in all of my 70 years, I'd never seen anything like this, like what happened, particularly at the end of this last election. Frightening how easily we could actually completely get taken over by another paradigm for the United States. Really bizarre. It was scary.
I think I could make an argument that it was a mindset of scarcity which made that possible.
Yeah.
It's tempting to have one factor explain it all. That doesn't work. But there's an interesting book called Strangers in a Strange Land by I believe is a UC Berkeley sociologist. And she went to a fairly large city in the South and lived there for several months and joined women's groups, doing whatever they're doing, knitting, hanging out, I don't know what. Mm-hmm. And she earned their trust. And so started to learn how they accounted for their troubles. This was before Trump, but leading up to him, it was to study the Tea Party.
Yeah.
And is really interesting because one of the things that she found is that the perception was that all these good things were being done for minorities to give them a better chance, whether it's affirmative action or all the other things that were happening. Lots of programs arising to help minorities. And they felt like all these people were jumping the line, and what you were supposed to do is work really hard, provide for your family, get a white picket fence, and so forth and so on.
Right.
But so much of it is, to me, and not just that situation, not just Strangers in a Strange Land, but other things that I think contributed to the rise of Trump. There's not enough to go around, and we have to grab and hold on to what we have and keep anyone from taking it. And what's ridiculous is America's GDP is growing, I think, like no other country.
Yeah.
We have the most of everyone, and yet we are convinced that we don't have enough.
Right.
And I wonder if a certain belief in God would convince you that scarcity is never the problem. It would prohibit you thinking in terms of scarcity that way. That if there is scarcity, the only reason that there's scarcity is that having more would cause us to act less well and become less prepared to handle more abundance. And this gets into a design theological framework. But I think it can make empirical predictions which can turn out to be more or less true. It would be what in us, we have so much now that we're acting as if we don't have enough. Other people, I have one of the elders at my church he used to live in Singapore. He was an ambassador, and he talked about when you are just scraping by and you don't necessarily have enough food for everyone, there's a communal sharing, and there's a lot less me.
Yeah.
And it's when you have enough to need to hire a police force to defend it against those who don't have.
Right.
That you shift away from the us to the me.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if the U.S. has too much, therefore has a scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
Therefore, we can't if God were to bless us with more in any interesting way, then it would be bad for us, which is not the way that you hear any, as far as I could tell, any discussion. But if you look at the Old Testament, I would say God had a problem, and that's the more he gave the Israelites, the more they turned away from him.
There's the thing about being poor and having billionaires lining our media at the same time is a problem. Okay. I mean, that's where you get into this I mean, even chimpanzees have a sense of fairness. You know, if you give one 3 nuts, you keep giving the other one 1, they get pissed off eventually, right? So, I mean, there is that disparity in income that can create quite a problem, and we may need to address that at some point. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah, the thing about having, like, here's something interesting, which is kind of may seem out in the left field, right? But when families go on vacation, oftentimes, and not often, but sometimes in America, what they do is they go camping with their children, right? And when we used to go camping with our children, we would spend 2 days doing nothing but preparing food, building shelters, cutting wood, feeding those little bastards, you know, taking care of them, entertaining them. And at the end, after 4 days, we're like, you know, we have done more work than we had in the entire past year. And at the end of it, it's like, God, that was fun. Had a really good time. You know, everybody was, you know, like you say, sharing food, you know, everybody doing their part, you know, pounding steaks and all of this stuff. And like camping is almost a way for a modern society to get back into, you know, touching the earth again, because we are miserable when we don't. You know, we never touch the earth. You know, we never dig the fields ourselves. We tend to be miserable. I think we're that kind of a critter. But anyway, that's kind of an aside.
Actually, I really like that, because movies like Wall-E, which I've only seen snippets of it on a plane, but I think I got the idea. It suggests that interaction with material reality is something to automate away.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that treats material reality as, if not evil, boring, distrustful, won't mold itself to our demands, so forth and so on.
Yeah.
And so it's just obnoxious to have to deal with. And if it has to be dealt with, robots are low-paid wage earners.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very Greek attitude.
Yeah.
Then the philosophers were people who didn't have to do backbreaking labor.
Yeah.
And there are large pressures to stratify your thinking so that only people in your class can understand it.
Right.
Which means being intentionally opaque to the people who are digging and watering and doing all the stuff that you have to do with material reality.
Yeah. I don't know. Happiest times of my life have been gardening.
Yeah. Camping and gardening treated as good. But when we worry about all of the tasks that deal with material reality being automated away, and look at all the people who their IQ isn't so high so they can do lots of abstractions and programming and such.
Yeah.
It's this attitude of creation is not good. Yeah. Or reality, if you don't like the word creation. But if you're a Christian and you really believe the very good of Genesis 1:31, and you don't believe that God is such a terrible engineer that one eating of a tree destroyed everything, then you're not allowed to say creation is bad.
Yeah.
It's a constraint that is very abstract in one way, but I think bears out in are there lots of opportunities to explore reality. Scientists and engineers are like the most disciplined form of it, but hobbyists. One of the cool things about YouTube is all the chemistry and other kind of hobbyists that are getting to teach each other how to do it better and better.
Right.
Especially if you're in some podunk town and there's so little hope that most people are drug addicts or engage in simpler pleasures. Don't have to judge it, but you have the occasional kid who wants to do chemistry experiments. With YouTube, there are a lot more opportunities to do that. But chemistry experiments are working with material reality. They're not abstractions. They're not programming.
Right. Yep.
And I think there's so much more opportunity where the, quote, low IQ people are maybe just the people who are super intelligent with their hands instead of with
Yeah.
abstractions. Maybe
Yeah.
there's a lot for them to do that we're not even seeing.
Yeah.
Because we have this fundamental distrust or lack of hope that matter can be very good.
Yeah.
And this is a place where my theology and belief that our world was created actually shows up, I think, in a fairly strong way. But you seem to have this belief without that, which goes back to your whole, like, is belief in God
Right.
necessary? And that N word I find is very interesting.
The naturalism word, you mean?
No, the necessary is like,
necessary.
Like all these arguments that God necessarily exists tries to frame reality according to necessity.
Yeah.
Which is the opposite of freedom. And it's similar to wanting the universe to be causally closed so that you can understand how everything is arranged. And ultimately, when you discover enough of the necessities, you can control.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you always exempt yourself from being as constrained as everyone else.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't see creation as being a feature. It sort of drains the beauty out of it for me, seeing it as chaotic and not caused on purpose, right? To see it as chaotic, yet having these patterns that it does, seems to me to be far more beautiful than the idea of some intelligence creating it, right?
So I think that is predicated upon a very claustrophobic understanding of creation that is very common in Christianity. God has a plan for everything.
Right.
And the more that God has his plans, the less that we can have our plans. And yet, I don't believe that very many strains of Judaism are claustrophobic in this way. But let me put this to you. You talked about when you are in conflict with somebody else, you take up to 3 days to chill out and figure out a better way to interact. Is it in some possible worlds, is that a bad strategy?
In some possible worlds, would that be a bad strategy?
Like, do you end up getting more and more oppressed by doing that in some possible?
Well, if I encountered a grizzly bear in the woods, it would be a very bad strategy, right?
True.
To wait 3 days to deal with them, right? Just whatever. Yeah, no.
But what I'm suggesting is that your approach to life, which would be religious for people who are religious, but your behavior and your thinking makes a lot of assumptions about the structure of the world.
Okay.
And yet there's still a lot of freedom and what you call chaos in the world.
Yep.
The two are not opposed to each other.
Yep.
And what I would contend is that what's important to assume about the world is that you can succeed in it without being terrible to other humans.
Okay.
And hopefully to non-humans as well, plants, animals. But you're not guaranteed that on every possible world. Some worlds might be red in tooth and claw. And if you don't participate, you become obsolete, you get killed, so forth and so on.
Right, right.
And so I think you are assuming there is structure to the world. It's just that you're not labeling it as created.
There's structure that basically the fact that I am, okay, the fact that evolution has put me where I am right now, okay, will conform to that structure that allows me to thrive in some manner, or at least, it's at some level. But with Buddhism, even if I didn't thrive, even if I, wasn't encountered something where I was erased or where I did not exist anymore, I should not be so attached to my existence that I would not accept that too, accept my own death. I mean, I am not going to survive. Okay. None of us are. None of us are getting out of this alive. Right. We're all getting out of this dead. So I mean, there is enough, there can't possibly be only negative. Okay, it's impossible for that to happen. There has to be, in order for there to be variation, there has to be grades of it, right? And so you're thankful for the parts that, that are on one end of the spectrum, and you're unafraid of and unattached to the other end of the spectrum. You know what I mean? So, I mean, it is a chaotic universe, and we are going to be erased. I'm going to die. Okay. The human race is going to disappear at some point in time. It's not likely to survive eternally, right? And the earth is not going to survive. The sun is not going to survive. The universe is not going to survive. Who cares? It is now, right?
The fundamentalists might be able to survive.
The what?
I said the fundamentalists might be able to maintain their identities.
Oh yeah. They might be out there alone. Whatever. Okay. Anyway, so I don't see now this claustrophobic creation. So you're kind of saying that God created this thing, but did not causally will and design everything. So he didn't impose his will on all of it, right? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, it's like a good manager wants certain things to be true, but lets the people managed figure out how to implement it.
Right. That's exactly what naturalism does. Exactly. That's exactly how naturalism created the universe, basically. That is the universe that we have. It's not, there are patterns, there are things that work, there are things that don't, there's this variation, there's this mix, but overall there are these immense patterns, that are happening. We are patterns. Okay, in order to be sentient, there had to be these patterns. That's sort of
but when I was talking about managers, I was getting at more, there are certain goals and purposes, which is very different from what scientific laws will get you.
Well, not necessarily. There are some things that, that laws are laws. There are. I'm
just gonna close this window.
Okay.
Okay.
There are very law-like parts of it. It's just that the law-like parts of it are these little structural laws that end up complexifying into macro emergent patterns. There are these emergent things based on these laws, but they're still law-like. So there's still a but overall goal. What do we need that for? What is the purpose of that? How would that fit into what's happening to us?
I mean, an overall goal would be a world in which no murder or rape or anything else like that needs to happen.
I don't think that is where you get to the point of utopian planning, right? And we know how utopias work. Utopias become dystopias because of the control. Because in order to have a utopia, in order to have absolutely no killers, no fringe, no problems, to completely eliminate all of it, is going to require a great deal of control, which in itself is the same as rape and murder. So you're over controlling.
Top down, yes, but I don't think
I'm looking for a middle way, and basically the idea that the easiest way for us to live, the way for us to live with the greatest happiness as modern sentient human beings, is that way of of less violence, less whatever, and all of that. And we can do a whole lot about that, and we can endeavor to do a lot about it. But if there was no murder, if there were no evil men, would we be concerned at all with not being evil? Okay, suppose we had 20 generations in which there was never anybody that ever hurt anybody else, right? Would we endeavor to not harm or to not hurt other people? It would completely disappear from our mindset.
I mean, this is very similar to questions of if there's going to be no suffering in heaven, how is that accomplished and why can't that happen without the brutal history on earth?
Yeah, and if it did, what would it really be like if there was no suffering?
I mean, one thing I would say is I actually think that humans could be a lot more awful to each other than they are now, and they're not doing it. And so that's the flip side.
Right.
I think we could learn to be less and less awful to each other. And I don't know how far that could go.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find really interesting in the Old Testament is that any wisdom gained seems to be lost within 4 generations. There seems to be some sort of decay rate.
Okay.
And you can see the same thing with, say, the stock market. By the time the people who are around for the last crash retire, you get another one.
Yeah.
And so we have a real problem passing forward knowledge and wisdom that maintain the actual lessons you learned without passing along falsehood as well.
Yeah.
Because most of what you learn is contingent on the circumstances. And the more the circumstances change, the more the wisdom is less transferable, less obviously applicable.
Right.
And the rate of change in society in the last 300 years has been so high that I think that's been a lot more obvious. If you rewind 1,000 years, following pretty precisely what your father did is probably a good idea to keep your town going, because a lot of the ways of doing things don't work.
Yeah.
So following what is known to work, probably a good idea. But is there a way to persist good lessons learned, the context which rendered them valid, adding noise where you're actually uncertain which way it was, such that you can accrue learning from generation on generation and not lose it 20 generations away, like you mentioned being a worry with the not hurting anyone? That's a puzzle I don't think we've figured out how to solve. I think we do need to solve it in order to appreciably improve how humans treat each other.
YouTube and the Wikipedia? I don't know. We are, like you said about the chemistry, we have a lot more now than we had when I was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway. But YouTube didn't prevent the rise of a demagogue. And with YouTube's algorithms of which video to suggest next, it could have even sown the seeds for a demagogue. Right. So I
watched one crazy Karen video 2 weeks ago, and I've had one after another to the point where I'm almost getting paranoid that I'm going to run into a real Karen out there somewhere. It's like, just because I watched that one damn video, it's like their algorithm is so momentarily altered, by your one choice. You make one little choice, right? I think they should average it up, right? I don't know.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think Google caters its YouTube suggestion algorithms to people like you and me.
Yeah.
And it's one of the big dangers of any sort of system where you try and scale up so you get economies of scale is all the unusual people get screwed over.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's like, could we as a nation have a conversation about that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure we're ready for it. And I think that's one of the more interesting problems to face is, big data is good for average people and average problems and average situations, average health problems. Yeah. But so much of human progress has happened on the fringes, not in the averages.
Right.
So, but that's probably its own whole conversation.
Its own thing. So the other thing that we were going to address, and we don't have time to, which is good because we can do a third session, is aboutness and intention, and some of the ideas about mind. Seeing as how I failed to get you to give up your belief in a deity, we can move on to another topic. But
I started reading a book on medieval understandings of intentionality, but the essay that I really wanted to read was somehow excluded from the PDF. But the thing that I keep coming to actually on this issue is free will and not intentionality. And the reason it's free will is that I've come to understand free will as the ability to characterize systems and then bend or break the rules that you find.
Okay.
And oftentimes people want a mechanism of free will. How does it work?
Yeah.
But the thing is, what's going to find the mechanism except for free will? And science figures out which way things are by presenting multiple ways that they could be, and then finding the one that best fits.
Yeah.
And if you can only propose one hypothesis, then that's very unhealthy because you're not comparing it against anyone. So it can be like a just so story. Well, it just is that way.
Yeah.
Well, it's really if you have a bunch of them fight in the ring, then you figure out which one comes out first. So free will has to be able to offer multiple different ways, multiple different possible mechanisms for free will, and then somehow pick one, which is, there might be a recursive defeat to the idea that proposing a mechanism for free will actually possibly works.
Yeah.
Okay. And what science is predicated upon our almost infinite ability to characterize things, find the most parsimonious version of it, and then take that, put it in our toolbox, explore more of reality, and do it over and over and over and over again. Any sort of mechanism to permanently constrain what free will could possibly do would permanently constrain what of reality we could possibly explore.
Okay.
And that gets you an asymmetry between mind and our current way of thinking about sort of ontology, atoms in the void, or whatever you want to say. There's a permanent asymmetry where free will can always outstrip our current conception of matter.
Okay.
Because it can always go on to a more complex understanding of matter.
That we will save.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's a little bit connected to intentionality, where this thing can be about that thing.
Yep.
Because free will is generating characterizations which have intention. So anyway,
okay. We'll get into that. And that, God, I'm going to come at you from the neuroscience perspective, right? And hopefully I can integrate the secular Buddhist perspective as well. But we'll do that next time.
Yeah, if you have any papers you want to send me beforehand, I'd love to take a look.
Oh my goodness, that would take a truck.
Well, but specifically in terms of intentionality.
Okay. Good enough. Yep. Okay,
Alrighty.
We'll end it there for the day, and hang around for a second. I'm gonna end the recording. So, goodbye, cruel world. That's my sign off.